We'll call to order the Friday, September 20th, 2024 meeting of the Georgia State Election Board. My name is John.
So the Georgia State Election Board met on Friday to consider nearly a dozen new rules, but one of them stood out much more than the others and attracted much more attention and concern, notably from many, many, many county election administrators in Georgia.
You're going to hear a lot of speaking today on both sides of these rules that are being proposed today. And, you know, the last thing we need is a lot of cheering and excess comments and all that stuff. If you want to be respected...
What the rule would do is it would require hand counting of ballots at the precinct level on election night or in subsequent days.
Amy Gardner covers voting for The Post. She's been paying really close attention to Georgia. She just got back from there where she watched this debate unfold over how the state should run election night in November. Specifically, a proposal to count every single ballot in Georgia, not only by machines, but also by hand. Election board members like Janice Johnston, who supported this measure, said it was necessary to increase transparency in a really tight race.
What we're trying to work for, what I'm trying to work for, is some uniformity. And if some counties are counting ballots and others are not, it's not uniform.
But the majority of Georgians who spoke at this meeting said they were worried that making this change this close to the election creates an unnecessary burden on election offices.
What this rule means is that election staff, many of whom are here today, are wedged into an ever more crushing situation of needing to perform superhuman feats under rules that make it...
These rules do not protect our elections. They undermine them.
I challenge you to go into any county in the state of Georgia and to do the rules that you're passing on today. Work as a poll worker all day and then count the ballots. The world is watching what we do here today.
Those comments echo what Amy has heard from officials across the state.
It just was a reminder of how upset and frustrated county election officials were. They had not been consulted. Their concerns had basically been ignored. And they also believe, and I think you heard a little bit of that in one of the remarks, that it will make things more chaotic and more confusing and sow more mistrust in the results.
But in the end, the board voted.
Member King, how do you vote?
Aye.
The chair will exercise his right to vote and will vote nay. The motion passes 3-2.
It passed. It passed 3-2 with the three members who form a conservative majority. All three are supporters of former President Donald Trump. All three have expressed their belief, their false belief that, irregularities and fraud tainted the 2020 election in Georgia. They have formed a majority on the board and have been in this absolute flurry of rulemaking ever since.
Amy says the aftermath of the 2020 election is still playing out in Georgia, a key battleground state. Just like 4 years ago, the race there is really tight. But how this election is actually going to be run there, the nuts and bolts of it are still in play. And that could affect the election's outcome.
What I do think is that it is a place where this, incredibly dramatic and concerning set of actions are taking place that could affect how that outcome is determined, and where unrest and upset over the result could spiral out of control, and that makes it just on its own a critical place to watch.
From the newsroom of The Washington Post, this is Post Reports. I'm Elahe Izadi. It's Tuesday, September 24th. Today, we turn to the critical state of Georgia, where one rule change could create a ripple effect and upend the entire November election. Amy explains how this happened. Well, first, Amy, I feel like there is so much about how elections actually work, like the minutia of it, that can feel wonky or granular. But this new rule passed by Georgia's state election board sounds really important. I know you were down in Georgia as this was happening. Can you explain to me exactly what does this rule do?
Sure. So it basically requires every county to hand count all the ballots cast. And I mean count the number of ballots, not tally up how each person voted on that ballot in all the races that are on the ballot. That would be even more burdensome. But counting the number of ballots at the precinct level on election night, or I believe for certain counties that are larger than a certain size, it can be in the subsequent days. And it has to be a team of 3 people in each precinct. And that process of making sure that the number of ballots cast equals the number of votes that were tabulated by the machines is called reconciliation.
So there is still a machine count. This is like after the machine.
Correct. But before it gets reported.
Oh.
And that's a really important detail because you're talking about holding up the reporting of the results to the central office. And those 3 people who count, they each have to count them. They have to separate the ballots into stacks of 50 and count them. And if each time they come up with their totals, they're off from each other, they got to start over again until they match and until the number matches the machine. And it holds up all the other things that they have to do. I mean, there's all kinds of things that have to get done in the precinct after voting closes. They have to close out the machines and have the machines run the reports that show how many people voted and how they voted. And those results have to get transmitted to the main county office. And the county office, in turn, has to add them all up together from all the precincts and transmit those to the Secretary of State's office. And this holds that whole process up.
You know, hearing you talk about counting by hand, I don't know, everyone probably has had the experience of like counting something out by hand and like someone in the room says a number or is also counting and then it throws you off and you're like, wait, I lost my place. I mean, that just sounds like it will take a long time.
Yeah.
Is that true? Does it take a long time and does it?
Of course. I mean, put 1,500 sheets of paper on a table and count them and see how long it takes you and see how long it takes you to get the same count as 2 other people sitting at the table.
And so how accurate are hand tallies? Are they better than machine tallies?
They're way worse. I mean, that's just the science on that is just absolutely, done. And the reason we use machines in elections is because they're more accurate. They were actually introduced in part with an argument that they eliminated the chance for fraud because of ballot stuffing back in, the olden days or whatever. So it's kind of ironic that now there's so much suspicion of machines being programmable or hackable or, prone to fraud because the reverse is actually true if the people running them are people of integrity and with the checks and balances that they have built into the system where they actually run accuracy tests and they run these sort of mini audits after the election to make sure that the machine count really is accurate. And, there's these safeguards that are built in.
Right. So what reason did the board give for making this change if what you're saying is true, that the science and research is very clear that hand tallies are less accurate? They're not as good as machine tallies.
So the board members believe that this new hand-counted way of making sure that the number of people who check in at a polling location equals the number of ballots actually cast is a way to sort of transparently show that people aren't coming into a polling location and voting twice.
So I think that what we're doing is creating more stability in our election process. If it extends it for a short period of time, let's do so that we can be accurate across the state.
A way to show that the poll workers aren't letting someone come in without checking in at the poll book station and then cast a ballot. And there's an insinuation that that's where the fraud happens, even though there's really no evidence for this. Now, there are plenty of instances where the poll book count and the tabulator count are off by a couple, not necessarily because of fraud, but sometimes people forget to hit the send button if it's a touchscreen voting machine.
Oh, like on their ballot.
Yeah. Sometimes people check in and they fill out the ballot and then they don't run it through the tabulator, like they walk away with it. That just happens. Like for any number of reasons, they decided they didn't want to vote after all, or they spaced and they left with their ballot without realizing they had to put it through the machine, whatever. So there are times when the poll book total doesn't match the tabulator total, and precincts are required to try to get to the bottom of that. They don't always get to the bottom of it, especially when it's clear that the number of the discrepancy isn't going to make a difference in any outcome. Like if there's a really close race where it's off by 1 or 2, then they really have to get to the bottom of that. But if there isn't, then they don't.
So, Amy, tell me a little bit more about the pushback to this decision in Georgia. Did you talk to anyone about why they were opposed to this, and what did they tell you?
I talked to many people about why they were opposed to it, and their reasoning was multifold. One, the time it takes, the amount of other tasks that they have to take care of on election night, the fact that counties are woefully underfunded. Election offices are often, 2, 3, maybe sometimes even 1 employee. They've got to bring in temporary workers for elections and make sure they have enough person power to do this job. So it's money and resources. And also, at the end of a 12 or 15-hour day, people are tired. So is it even going to be accurate? I was really struck by some of the speakers, including one poll worker, Jacqueline Isaacson, who talked about how much hard work is involved in working at the polls on Election Day.
My fellow poll workers and I receive a modest stipend, but we do this to serve. We're carrying out the election process. The proposed rules will crowd locations, cause chaos in what is already an intense yet organized process, and critically, there's a high potential for personal information being compromised and poll workers being intimidated.
It was hard not to hear, the indignation of being sort of almost accused of not being trustworthy with these people who are effectively volunteers and for whom there really isn't any evidence of wrongdoing. But there's one reason that people gave me for their opposition that I think is one of the most interesting. And that is, several weeks ago, this same board passed a different rule that critics say empowers county election boards not to certify their results if they have concerns about the legitimacy of those results. Now, the board that passed this rule, the state board, claims that they are not advocating for county boards to miss the statutory deadline of certifying the results, which is the Monday after the Tuesday of the election. But it's not clear to anybody that county boards will understand that. And because this rule empowers them to launch these investigations into the results if they have questions about it, there is a view that this second rule is intended to give those county boards the evidence that they need to postpone certification by introducing a discrepancy into the picture.
So it's basically like, first, if we were to follow this logic, we're going to create a system by which you can say, oh, there's a discrepancy. Hold the horses here. And then 2, now let's make a rule that makes it easier to say there's a discrepancy.
Right. I mean, the phrase that like 6 different county election administrators use, so they obviously must have discussed this in a chat group or something, was that this is a feature, not a bug. Like as if they're setting counties up to produce errors, non-matching reconciliation numbers that would then empower the county board not to certify or canvass the result, which is a step that they must do before they send the results countywide off to Atlanta, to the Secretary of State's office.
After the break, Amy explains who is behind the push to hand count votes and the legal fight brewing against the new rule. We'll be right back. So, Amy, I would love to turn now to learning a little bit more about who exactly is on this elections board in Georgia. How did they get into the situation where they are now making this rule?
So the Georgia State Election Board is a 5-member board. Each seat is appointed by a different entity. One person is appointed by the state Republican Party, and that's a woman named Janice Johnston. She's a retired obstetrician and kind of the ringleader of the people who are passing all these rules. As of May, a vacancy that went to the House was filled by someone who is a pretty strong Trump supporter, and that gave the Trump supporters of the board a 3-member majority. And that's when this flurry of rulemaking began. The 3 MAGA members of the board were actually called out by name by former President Trump at his rally in Atlanta earlier this year.
They're on fire. They're doing a great job. 3 members: Janice Johnson, Rick Jeffries, and Janelle King. 3 people are all pit bulls fighting for honesty, transparency, and victory. They're fighting. Are they here? Where are they?
Dr. Johnston was at the rally in the second row. You can see her stand up and wave and sort of, get a cheer from the people around her when Trump name checks her.
They just passed a rule for Georgia elections requiring that 3 people at each precinct independently count the total number of ballots before certification. Who could be against that? Who could be against it?
And then there was a meeting, just in the subsequent days, that very next week after the Trump rally in Atlanta. And as she walked into the room, you could hear people saying, "Look, she's the hero." And it was like she'd become a star in the MAGA world. And that was really concerning to people, that it made it seem as though this 3-member majority was passing rules explicitly to help Donald Trump win his election in Georgia.
I mean, okay, so you basically have this 5-member body and 3 of the members are name checked by Trump, and you see a member at a Trump rally. I guess, how is this allowed that these are the people who get to, is this normal?
It's not, it has not been the norm in recent election cycles. I mean, I think it's important to say that election boards are typically partisan. They're typically appointed by the parties. And it is not unusual for, party lawyers to be involved in asking, encouraging, pressuring election boards to do their work in a particular way that is beneficial to that party. And so I want to be clear, this is unusual, but it's not completely off scale away from the norm, if that makes sense. It's certainly unusual to see such a outspoken and active member of the state board be so openly, publicly in support of one of the presidential candidates. And she's been called out for it by a lot of people. They think it's just inappropriate. Even if she supports President Trump, should she be signaling that support so flagrantly? And many people in Atlanta say no, she should not.
What about Republicans elected statewide in Georgia? Are they behind this new hand count rule?
So Brad Raffensperger, the Republican Secretary of State, he has come out opposed to these rules. Republican Attorney General Chris Carr's office issued an opinion saying that the state election board was violating the law by even passing these rules, because these rules exceed their authority. These rules are effectively setting statute because they don't stem from existing statute. So no, the answer is no. Statewide Republicans are not really big fans of what this state board is doing right now.
Amy, I wonder if this hand counting rule is even going to go into effect. Are there any legal challenges against it that stand a chance?
There will almost certainly be a lawsuit. It hasn't dropped yet. And I mean, there's a attorney general official opinion declaring this rule about the hand counting illegal. So that's kind of amazing. And by the way, the Attorney General is the official lawyer of the state election board by statute.
So can he just refuse to enforce it? Or the way things stand now, if nothing changes, this is going to be how it has to happen?
I mean, the way it stands, if the state board enacts a rule, the counties have to follow it, barring intervention. And right now, the intervention that they're awaiting is court intervention.
I see.
I mean, nobody has the authority to say, no, that rule can't go into effect, except for a judge in a court proceeding.
Wow. I think all of us remember 2020 and all of the drama, specifically over Georgia, because it was such a close race. And I'm wondering if right now it's just worth setting some expectations of, I think we're now all used to the idea of we might not find out who is the president the night of the election. But these rule changes could delay things even more. So what is the expectation that you are now, when you talk to your friends and colleagues and family members, what are you telling them to brace for on election day and week?
It's a really good question, and I'm not sure I know the answer about Georgia as it relates to this hand counting of the number of ballots. And I also don't feel confident to say that that requirement will still be in place by Election Day, because I do think there's going to be litigation. So would this be a burden for election officials? Yes. Would it delay things? Yes. Would it delay things by months? No, I don't believe so. I think it's a huge hassle, and election officials believe it's an unnecessary hassle. But I think there are actually other places in the country, Pennsylvania being at the top of the list and Arizona maybe being a close second, where the counting will take much longer. Even if this controversy in Atlanta doesn't disrupt the reporting of results in a way that threatens, the convening of the Electoral College for whoever the winner is. The fact that this churn is still out there and is still occupying the attention of state and county boards, and it has the potential to produce errors, just feeds the mistrust in our elections. And feeding the mistrust in our elections right now is dangerous because of the potential for violence. So that if you have a whole, close to 50% of the country that's been told that they're cheating in Georgia, they're not counting right, Trump really won, what are the chances that somebody's going to want to do something violent? And I think that when you have so many people around the country continuing to believe that fraud and incompetence are just epidemic in our election administration, falsely, I should say, then that's a real risk that violence could ensue if the election doesn't go the way those people want it to.
Well, Amy, thank you for taking the time to share your reporting and insights with us. I really appreciate it.
You're welcome.
Amy Gardner is a national reporter who covers voting for The Post. Before I sign off, I wanted to share an update on a major conflict unfolding in the Middle East. The situation in Lebanon is escalating. As of Tuesday morning, Israel has struck 1,500 targets within a 24-hour period. Israel said it hit sites linked to the militant group Hezbollah. These strikes have sent thousands of people in Lebanon fleeing, and at least 564 people, including 50 children, have been killed. That's according to Lebanon's health ministry. Hezbollah fired more rockets at Israel on Tuesday. This is the most intense fighting across the Israel-Lebanon border since the start of the Gaza war last October. World leaders are warning the conflict could turn into an all-out regional war beyond Gaza. Here is UN Secretary General Antonio Guterres speaking at the UN General Assembly on Tuesday.
Lebanon is at the brink. The people of Lebanon, the people of Israel, and the people of the world cannot afford Lebanon to become another Gaza.
President Joe Biden also spoke, saying a diplomatic solution is the only path to lasting security for Israel and Lebanon, and that, quote, a full-scale war is not in anyone's interest. This is a rapidly developing story, so stay tuned. We'll be digging into the latest news out of Lebanon on Post Reports later this week. There's one other story that caught my eye. So if you've spent any time on the internet lately, you've probably come across Moodang, the baby pygmy hippopotamus. Her name roughly translates to bouncing pig, and she was born a couple of months ago in a zoo in Thailand. Since then, she's captivated people all over the world. Here she is being washed by her zookeeper. You can hear the adoring crowds marveling at her, trying to nibble back at him. But I've wondered, what is it about this tiny, chubby creature that has so many of us obsessed? It turns out there is a scientific reason for this. My colleague Maria Luisa Paul reported on research that explains our fascination with Moodang. Cute animals have human baby-like features. I'm talking big eyes and pudgy bodies, and we interpret that as helplessness. That helplessness triggers humans' ingrained nurturing instinct, which is something we've developed as an evolutionary trait. It's helped us humans survive for millennia. According to one study, researchers found that instinct in humans is so strong that it can cross species. So basically, Moodang's cuteness has hijacked our brains. That's it for Post Reports. Thanks for listening. If you're looking for the latest updates on the big news of the day, check out our morning news briefing, The 7. You'll get the 7 stories you need to know about every weekday morning by 7 a.m. You can find it wherever you listen to podcasts. Today's show was produced by Emma Talkoff with help from Lucas Trevor. It was mixed by Sean Carter and edited by Monica Campbell with help from Rena Flores. Thanks to Griff Whitty. I'm Elahe Izadi. We'll be back tomorrow with more stories from The Washington Post.